Hello, I'm Tim Farmer, and I've got a Kentucky campfire story for you. This is the most fantastic story I have ever heard. It involves murder. It involves espionage. It involves pirates. It involves treasure. We start this story with 1,600 pounds of treasure, pieces of 8, dated 1730 to 1760. Found in a cave near Jenkins, Kentucky. Yes, you heard me right. 1,600 pounds documented of treasure in a cave near Jenkins, Kentucky. Growing up near Maysville, Kentucky as a kid, I always heard stories about Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton. We were right there in historic Washington, Kentucky, right around the corner. The Battle of Blue Licks, the last battle of the Revolution. That's where Daniel Boone lost one of his sons. The history was so rich, but all those stories during that period of time that I heard were Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton. In 1977, I moved to the northeastern part of the state in Carter County. Now, the stories changed. The first time I went out with my old squirrel hunting buddy, Dexter Wilburn, he started telling stories about the great cave of the Shawnee and Jonathan Swift. And I said, who is this Jonathan Swift? And I was thinking Gulliver's Travels, the author of that book. And he said, no, this fellow was in here, he was mining silver. And every old timer had a story about silver and silver mining and Jonathan Swift. I began to realize this was a regional thing. Anything east of 75, you're more likely to hear people talking about Jonathan Swift and silver. Well, when I went to college, I started talking to my professor about geology and Jonathan Swift. There's no silver to be mined in Kentucky. So how is it that little pockets of treasure are springing up? How is it that 1,600 pounds of pieces of 8 were found in a cave near Jenkins, Kentucky, and no silver in Kentucky? So my whole life, I chased this story. I tried to find folks who knew something about it, and I ran into brick walls. You'd find a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, a little bit there, but no definitive answers about who Jonathan Swift was. And only recently did I start hearing stories about this silver that was found. The fellow who found it passed away a few years ago. This is one of those coins from that cave. And he also said that in that cave, he left as much as he took out. Not too long ago, a chance meeting, out of the blue, I was handed a book about Jonathan Swift. Somebody had done the hard work that nobody else had done. No historian had found land holdings under Jonathan Swift's name. Nobody else had found out that Jonathan Swift was best friends with George Washington and some of our founding fathers. I had a chance to sit down with the author of this book, and he absolutely cured my quest. And the real treasure is not necessarily this piece of silver, but I finally found out who Jonathan Swift is and why pockets of silver have been found here and there, and one rather large one near Jenkins, Kentucky. Let's go visit with Robert right now. So here I sat with Robert Prather. First of all, I want to thank you for doing the heavy lifting for a lot of people who want to know what's the real story behind Jonathan Swift. Thank you very much.
Well, it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun too to trace down this legendary mythical figure.
Why did you take the time and the effort? What inspired you to want to do this whole thing?
Oh, I actually started looking into the Swift legend back in probably the mid-'80s.
Do you remember the first time you heard about it?
Oh, that was a long time ago, probably back in the 70s when I first heard about it. Swift is actually mentioned prominently in history books and was even mentioned in a lot of classroom books.
Everybody who was above 70, when I was running around as a kid in the northeastern part of the state, had a story about where they thought the cave was. And they found some silver over here and all these strange stories. And then I talked to my history professor, not really discounted it, but wanted to move off to another subject. And that kind of threw me off. I thought, nobody really knows.
It definitely has been a blacklisted topic.
Now this right here, just this noise right here, and seeing this silver, there's 3 pieces that actually came from that original 1,600 pounds in the cave near Jenkins, Kentucky. The real question that the historians have that everybody wants to know, who was Jonathan Swift?
Jonathan Swift lived in Alexandria, Virginia. For 40 years he was a merchant there, and he was a very prominent merchant. He owned the largest mansion in Alexandria, which he and his wife referred to as Bel Air. Jonathan also had a nickname for the place. He called it Grasshopper Hall. And like I said, it was the largest mansion of Alexandria, Virginia. I guess that's kind of fitting for a guy associated with all this treasure.
He had some pretty heavy-duty friends, did he not?
As heavy-duty as it comes for any time period. He was friends and close associates with a host of, I refer to them as founding fathers. George Washington, of course, being one of them. Swift was born in 1764 in Milton, Massachusetts. His father's name was Samuel Swift. And Samuel was a Boston lawyer and practiced law with John Adams, our second president. So by finding this out about Swift, we're beginning to see, well, maybe he's not quite the buckskin, tobacco-spitting guy that has been portrayed in legend.
He's a blue blood.
He's a blue blood. That's exactly right. His father, Samuel, was one of the Mohawk Indians of the Boston Tea Party. And because of that, he was imprisoned and was treated poorly while he was imprisoned.
He died in prison, correct?
That's right. In a letter that his mother, Jonathan's mother, wrote, she refers to her and the children being in the woods at this time, afraid to go back to their home. And this was while the Redcoats had captured Boston. She actually wrote in the letter that Samuel was murdered. She said he was treated poorly, but she said in reality he was murdered. So that's pretty harsh, and Jonathan he was about 9 years old at this time, and that would have stuck with him forever.
So you would probably say he had a pure hatred for the British.
He was probably waiting for his opportunity. Jonathan married in 1785 to Nancy, and sometimes referred to as Anne Roberto, and some people pronounce it Roberto. Her father was a founding father of the United States, Brigadier General Daniel Roberto. He served on the Continental Board of Congress. He also was a Brigadier General under George Washington. And Roberto, he opposed the marriage, but Jonathan and Anne slipped out one night and eloped. And by that, we know that Jonathan was no coward, because Roberto was a big man and a powerful man.
Didn't he own some ships?
I don't actually have a bill of sale showing where Jonathan Swift owned a ship, but there are numerous ads that was in like the Alexandria Times, the Alexandria Advertiser, Alexandria Times, stating that if you wanted to get a berth in one of these ships, or if you had something to ship, to check with Jonathan Swift. So he was in charge of all these ships, and in fact, he owned a wharf. It was referred to as Merchant's Wharf in Alexandria, Virginia.
Now the plot thickens. This man, so well connected, with access to many, many ships, and had a working silver mine, correct, near Alexandria?
He did.
How did he get from the East Coast to Kentucky, and how do we find coins in Jenkins, and how do we relate all this together? Did he own land in Kentucky?
He did not only own land, he owned over 160,000 acres of land throughout Kentucky, from the east to the west.
You know, and if you look where these land holdings are, you're going to find that a lot of this area was associated with caves. Am I correct?
That's right. Much of that land is associated with caves. It's also associated with some sort of mining. I've determined that Swift was not only interested in silver and gold mining, as the legends state, but he was also probably into stone quarries, even gypsum mining, when he refers to in an ad that one of his properties has plaster of Paris on it. He's referring to gypsum. And then from other ads, I know that Swift had rock quarries on his property, so we know that he was mining. Daniel Roberto, his father-in-law, historically was associated with mining. During the Revolutionary War, he erected Fort Roberto, which is located present-day near Altoona, Pennsylvania. He set that fort up for the purpose of lead mining, getting lead for the war. And I know from other documentation that Roberto had large investments in iron mining. So Roberto was heavily invested in mining. And there's no doubt in my mind that Swift became involved with mining through his father-in-law.
Where did you go to find this information?
Much of it came from the county clerk's archives, and it begins with one deed book. I did get lucky on some and found Swift's name listed among them. Other ones you have to go through page by page, and so it takes a while, quite a while.
You cracked the code on this. A lot of folks, including older historians, they kind of pushed it aside. When you went to all that effort and you looked through these documents and you found these things,
he discovered Jonathan Swift again. He brought him back to life. He is not a legendary figure. He was real.
we went to Ron D. Bryant. For him to say what he said about your work is pretty tremendous.
Robert had gotten a lot of information about him, and he put together a mass of notes. I remember telling him many times, you have outdone any historian I've known on your subject here. You have really gone through everything that possibly could be found, and that's impressive.
So you've done the work. You've dug ever so deep, and you have laid this thing out. You've found out who Jonathan Swift was. I love that you're putting flesh on the bones here. Let's talk about his cast of characters, the people that he was surrounded with. We know their names, we know where they owned land, and then once we establish the names of his friends, I want to talk about comparisons to one of the most famous treasure stories ever. Now let's talk about some of his traveling companions, some pretty surly looking fellows.
We get that from the legend. Yeah, and I'd say some of those names you could probably go to the bank on. Others may have been embellished. One of the names typically associated with was a gentleman by the name of Mundy. Mundy was one of the guys. Another guy was Blackburn. One of the more important people is a gentleman by the name of Montgomery, who happened to be the coin maker for the Swift Company. One additional gentleman I'd like to mention here is a guy by the name of Flint.
Mm-hmm.
And I found him particularly interesting because it's my belief that Treasure Island was based upon the story elements of the Swift legend. And one of the primary characters of Treasure Island was the bloodthirsty Captain Flint.
Now, who wrote that book, Treasure Island?
Robert Louis Stevenson.
What connection did Robert Louis Stevenson have with this area, Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee?
The That is a question that has crossed many people's mind. What in the world could Robert Louis Stevenson from Scotland know about Kentucky and Swift legend? What could he know about it? Well, come to find out that Robert Louis Stevenson, he was having health problems. And he went to a place, it was a health colony in Grèce, France. And while he was there, he met a lady by the name of Fanny Osborne. Well, at that time, Fanny was married to Samuel Osborne from Louisville, Kentucky. Stevenson and Fanny fell in love. And before it was all over with, Stevenson came to the United States, went clear across the country, and went to California and marries this girl that was from Indiana. Her husband, her former husband, was from Louisville, Kentucky. We're seeing where Stevenson may have got some elements for Treasure Island. He married Fanny Osborne in 1880. By 1881, he had written The Sea Cook, which was later renamed Treasure Island.
Oh, I was pleased to death with all of the research that Prather had done. I was just terribly impressed. And I told him one time, I said, "You've put the historians to shame, I'll tell you that, you really have." But then he had one other little connection that just blew me away, and that was the Robert Louis Stevenson connection of Long John Silver and Treasure Island. Yes. That caught my attention, because when he started presenting what he had found in connection with that, it started making wonderful sense to me. All of these stories were combining now. You had the legend of the silver mine, you had the legend of the great wealth hidden, and then Robert Louis Stevenson, of course, traveled in America. And you've got to remember, people of literary background like Stevenson read most of the popular publications of the time. Of course, even Harper's published in the 1880s an entire article on Jonathan Swift's silver mine. And then you start playing all of these coincidences in Long John Silver's tale, Treasure Island, and they start making even more sense.
One of the things that I found highly interesting in Kentucky, specifically on two of the more interesting properties, a gentleman by the name of Jacob Myers adjoined Swift. And each time, Jacob Myers owned the tract of land that had the salt works on it. And this all becomes pretty interesting when you come to find out that there was an old way of refining silver that was called the patio process. And it required huge amounts of salt to refine the silver. Well, it just so happens Jacob Myers was historically known to have been the guy that built the Bourbon Iron Blast Furnace in Kentucky. So he was a furnace builder. He was a guy that was in the business of refining metals.
How do we tie this stuff together? There were very specific stories of 100 horses at a time coming through the mountains of Kentucky with Jonathan Swift and his folks loaded with silver. You can't bring 100 horses at a time through any place, even during that time, and not be noticed. What were they doing? If they did have silver, where did it come from? And what in the world would Jonathan Swift be doing with this treasure?
It's my opinion that Swift did not acquire the treasure in Kentucky, but he did bring mule trains or horse trains.
For how many years?
The legend states history has it for 10 years that he came into Kentucky and stowed in what legend refers to as a great cave.
Now, these fellows that at the time were in their 70s and 80s who I hunted with, who told about a great cave of the Shawnee, and they would talk about this and that and the other. These fellows were born around the turn of the last century or even before. Everybody in their age group had fantastic stories. It was in their immediate reach. It was a huge amount of people that know about this.
Family knowledge.
Family knowledge. But this went back, and it was everybody had a story way back when.
And that's one of the most enjoyable pastimes that people have, especially in rural areas, are legends. And as the years passed, The silver mine legend grew and grew and grew until it got bigger than life itself.
This was such common knowledge at the time that there was a silver rush and people were actively looking for silver way back when, correct?
There was a lot of reasons why people would have come into the state in droves, because I think there was a lot of eyewitnesses. You can't bring 100 pack horse train into Kentucky without somebody seeing it. That's a huge horse train.
Very well-known people disappeared looking for the treasure. Tell us about that, if you will.
One of the first people to disappear while looking for the Swift silver mine was John Filson, who was also Kentucky's first historian and first cartographer for Kentucky. He actually took out a land entry. That was one of the segments that you had to do. It was a four-part process that you had to go through to get land patented or granted to you by the state. And one of the early steps was to get a land entry. John Filson and a gentleman by the name of Robert Breckenridge filed for a land entry that had 1,000 acres of land in the eastern part of Kentucky that was supposed to include a silver mine, and a man by the name of Swift showed him where it was, and there was supposedly a furnace nearby also. So Filson disappeared.
Who else?
Just 5 years later, another famous Kentuckian. And in his day, he was as famous as Daniel Boone, if not more famous, because it was none other than James Harrod, who built the first settlement in Kentucky, Harrodsburg. It's a known fact that in 1793, James Harrod went off with a gentleman by the name of Bridges, so the account says, and they were both in search for the Swift silver mine. That's the last anybody ever seen of him. He was never seen again.
Oh, of course, poor James Harrod, who will never know what happened to him. Maybe he did go off looking for the mine and it was never found again. Of course, Filson also wandered off and was never found again. And so there you go, two primary characters, one who wrote about it, one who supposedly was seeking it, Harrod, and they both disappeared and were never heard from again.
To this day, there are people that have spent their lives still looking for that. Now you imagine finding 1,600 pounds of pieces of 8 dated from the 1730s to the 1760s in a cave in Jenkins, Kentucky. Now let's talk just a little bit about that. Bill Gibson found these coins. We have footage of him, but he went back in there with, was it mail sacks or mail bags, and he would come out with 100 pounds at a time. And we have pictures here of him actually weighing one of these sacks on some scales.
That's right.
Now, as you can imagine, finding this amount of treasure was a pretty big deal. Why has the world not heard of it? Well, a few people have, and the word's starting to get out. We talked to somebody recently who actually knew Bill Gibson.
When he first started talking about finding treasure, he said that I asked him about the treasure he'd found. He told me about it. He told me what cave he'd went into and how many loads it took to get out and taken.
How many loads? How much did he bring out?
He took 16 loads out of silver out at 100 pounds a load, and they fit into a dynamite bag that he had from that he got from work. He said he'd put it on his toe and drag it from one side to the other, and he said the last time he would have brought more out, but the last time I reckon he went in the cave, he tried to bring 200 pounds out. He said, I got greedy. He said that he left at least another 1,600 pounds in there.
Wow.
And he said they were still in the cupboard in a pile. If you go back in there and crawl around, you said you'll find that pile of coins in there.
I had heard about the Swift silver mine from the time I was probably 7, 8 years old. And even down where I was born in southern Kentucky, they talked about it constantly, that there was this huge treasure that was buried in Kentucky, and somebody by the name of Jonathan Swift had found a silver mine, a huge silver mine, and then lost it. And it's been lost ever since, but some people would always say, now so-and-so knows where that is. They know the truth about that, and one day it'll come out. And so that made you think, my goodness, is there this vast treasure in Kentucky?
All right, now let's talk about his vast land holdings and tell us where they were.
I'll tell you, the first properties that I found in a deed room, archives, was a property that was in Old Hardin County. Now keep in mind that there was actually 3 counties in Kentucky to begin with: Jefferson, Fayette, and Lincoln. And this would have originally been part of the old Jefferson County, which dwindled down to Hardin County. And it was when Swift purchased this property that it was Hardin County, but the property contained 20,718 3/4 acres of land.
Pretty big chunk of land.
And that was the first property that he purchased in Kentucky, and that was in 1791. He also purchased another property in 1791, which was not too many miles away from that, and that was also in Old Hardin County. He purchased a number of properties in western Kentucky, which totaled roughly, again, about 20,000 acres, give or take a little bit. There were some other properties that he owned in eastern Kentucky. And it was great when I found that one, because that's where the legend is so concentrated, is in eastern Kentucky. And there he was, situated on the Big Sandy River, which legend has him.
He found this treasure in this cave, and it was apparently quite a task to get to where he went to. Now, Bill was a storyteller, but he comes out of there 100 pounds at a time, as much as he could carry. Was that anywhere near any of Swift or his companions' properties?
When Bill found that treasure hoard back in the early 1960s, 7 of those nail kegs full of these Spanish pieces of 8. When he found that, he had pretty well known that he had found something associated with Swift here. But that's all he had, these coins. And he had the story of Swift, which was great. You know, that was enough for most people to say, yeah, that's probably Swift's treasure. And he also believed that he found it in the Great Cavern of the Shawnee, which was associated with the legend. But that's all he had to build on. He didn't have any other concrete proof other than that. Other than through the legend, he didn't have any way to associate Swift. But now through archival work, I did find that Jonathan Swift was granted through the state of Virginia his largest tract of land. In eastern Kentucky, it was 100,000 acres of land that Jonathan Swift owned. In present day, Pikeville sits upon land that appears to have been owned by Jonathan Swift. Now, to the south of this property was another huge tract of land, and it was 100,000 acres also, and it was owned by a gentleman by the name of Montgomery.
His coin maker.
And it just so happens that's the area that Bill Gibson found the coins. Now, just above Swift's 100,000 acre tract of land, Montgomery owned another tract of land that contained 142,000 acres. 142,000 acres. And so that's 350,000 acres, give or take a little bit. That was all from Pine Mountain and went up toward Johnson County, which was where Swift's other properties were that adjoined Jacob Myers again. Jacob Myers, the furnace builder, and once again Jacob Myers owned the Salt Lick.
So let's put some pieces together, and let's start looking at this puzzle. A man connected with the founding fathers, a man who hated the British, a man who had a working silver mine in Alexandria or around Virginia somewhere, a man who had access to ships, a man who was traveling through all parts of Kentucky, a man who owned over 100,000 acres, correct?
Closer to 200,000 acres.
200,000 acres in Kentucky. A man who traveled, without a doubt, 100 horses at a time, loaded with, as best we can tell, silver, going through the mountains using the cave system, and eventually, and here's the kicker, one of his land holdings is right next to Fort Knox. Right there in that part of which is cavernous as well around.
It's on the Fort Knox Reservation, military reservation. And the neat part about it is that's another property that Jacob Myers adjoins, the furnace builder. And that's another property that contains the Salt Lick that Myers owned. And the Myers property sits within just a few miles of where the gold vault sits today.
That is interesting. That's one of those coincidences that really we still have to say historically is a coincidence, but it is an intriguing coincidence. As I've told other people, that did seem odd at the time, and if I didn't know just a little bit more about the politics of the era, I would have said that's really, really extraordinary. But Kentucky, you've got to realize during the Great Depression era, when Fort Knox was chosen to be where it is now, Kentucky politically was very important to the administration at that time, and so they put Fort Knox there. Now, did they know something we don't know? You don't know. The government's never very talkative when it comes to things like that. But when one coincidence after the other keeps happening, then again, there's something there. So I don't know about that. But that would be one of the most intriguing things that ever could be found. But I truly doubt that the federal government will tell us anytime soon about it.
There's only one thing that makes sense. It's where history and legend comes together. It's got to be that Swift was protecting our original treasury of the United States.
This is the real national treasure story.
That's correct. Jonathan Swift appears to have been the leader, the man in charge of safeguarding our first treasury in the United States. That's a good thing they did, because in 1812, when the British came back over here, one of the first places they went, of course, was the Treasury building. They looted it, didn't find anything. But that was due to the forethought of George Washington. It gets back to who Jonathan Swift was associated with. George Washington, of course, was in charge of our treasury at the time. He was the president of the United States. Some people under him would have been Daniel Roberto, whose one of his jobs on the Continental Congress was serving on the Board of Treasury. Daniel Roberto's son, Isaac Roberto, served under Joseph Nurse, who was the clerk for the Treasury. And Daniel Roberto's brother-in-law, James Milligan, was the comptroller for the Treasury.
George Washington had much knowledge of land in Kentucky.
He did. He actually was in Kentucky. He owned land in Kentucky, not far from where the Swift property number 1 was that he purchased in 1791.
George Washington had quite a bit of land in Kentucky. A lot of people forget that. One of the ways Washington made his wealth was through land speculation, and he owned thousands of Kentucky acres, so he was very prominent in that. And anyone in Virginia who wanted to make money would be investing in Kentucky land, either by surveying it off or buying it literally dirt cheap. You could get it. And so the two had similar interests there in their land dealings. Swift had thousands of acres, of course, that he laid claim to. Washington had thousands of acres that he laid claim to. And if some of that land that Swift actually owned, some of it was in very rough areas, as you well know. Some of it was not in such a rough area. I mean, we get on to the Hardin County, Breckinridge County areas, which is not exceedingly rough land. Of course, the eastern Kentucky mountains, if I'd wanted to hide anything, that's where I would have hidden it.
Swift would have been one of Washington's pawns, basically. He had a job to do.
George Washington was not a man to hand out a gift. He kept his stuff, and George Washington gave him what important gift?
I mean, you can't imagine that he would give away what nowadays would be referred to as basically a national treasure. It was a portrait of George Washington after the Battle of Princeton, and it was painted by Charles Wilson Peale. And Jonathan Swift was given that by Washington. The portrait hangs today at the Indianapolis Museum of Art.
Wow, that's a statement in itself.
It states on the plaque that George Washington presented this portrait to his friend, Jonathan Swift.
The documentation is overwhelming there, that he was a person to be reckoned with. He was a person that was on the scene. He was a person who evidently had Washington's trust. And you know, Washington was a person who didn't trust a lot of people. He really didn't. And you've got to also think about Washington and Swift in this case. George Washington was, and I mean this in a positive point, he was one of the most devious thinking men I've ever read about. I mean, he basically set up the spy system for the new country here, the United States. And so he was thinking along lines of how to outdo the British, how to always outflank them, not only militarily, but in other things too. Money was one of the biggest difficulties that the young republic had. We just didn't have any money. And if someone like Swift could have provided funding like that, he would have been George Washington's bosom buddy. Sure. And so all through these years, when Swift, even as the government was established, he became more and more prominent in, we'll say, in national councils than just somebody off the street ever could have been. Mm-hmm. So I would say there is something there that was important enough that kept him close to Washington.
1,600 pounds of silver, pieces of 8, dated from the 1730s to 1760s, in a cave in Kentucky.
Now, each one of those horse trains would have contained quite a bit more than what was found by Bill Gibson.
Sure.
And you take that over a period of maybe 1 or 2 trips per year over a 10-year period, you're talking about quite a bit of...
It's a lot of loot.
That's a lot of weight in gold and silver coins.
Now, Bill, he wanted to tell the story, but then he kind of draw back a little bit and think, maybe I shouldn't, you know. But he'd give so much. It's like the rabbit and the fox, you know. He'll give a little bit, then he'll take a little back. Towards the end of his life, he started talking more.
If you're going to be a prospector, that's hunt for John Swift silver mine, the main requirement that over about 6% of the main requirement is got to be crazy. That's the main thing.
He even showed up to do talks, and he had a book where he would show some of the coins in various and different quality, so good coins to bad coins.
That's correct. I have a CD of him speaking to the Big Sandy Historical Society, and he had several samples of his coins there that day. As a matter of fact, he had a pretty large, it looked like a photo album, and he had those things, that the leaves of the photo album filled with these silver coins.
Hear that sound? It's a good sound.
It's got a good sound to it.
I want you to look at these, and we see various, look at that, that's almost like a brand new coin.
This one's like mint, like it just came out of Mexico.
Yes.
See that right there? That means that it was minted in Mexico.
And the date on that, 1757.
1757.
Now, as we look at these are in pretty good shape. As we look on over here, looks like somebody about wore the mold out, doesn't it?
That's my interpretation, and that also goes along with the legend very well too.
Mm-hmm.
Seth Montgomery in legend is supposed to have been the coin maker for the group. And we know for a fact that there was a gentleman by the name of Montgomery that owned land that happened to run along Pine Mountain here where these coins were found. And these are coins that Bill Gibson found back in what he referred to as the Great Cavern of the Shawnee in Pine Mountain.
And he feels like that was the big one.
I think that he thought that he found the mother lode, yes.
What do you think?
And, well, I mean, it is a mother lode of treasure discoveries. There's no question about that. But it doesn't tell the whole story about Swift, but it is a big affirmation by having a Montgomery owning the property that the coins were found on. Swift adjoins Montgomery on the northern line, and these coins were found in this cave that adjoins the Montgomery property, if not on the Montgomery property.
This in itself is a minute part of the story. The story that we're doing is about Jonathan Swift, how he was almost dismissed. And over time, as you dug and we start bringing these things out, now look at you holding that many. Is that the most coins from him, from Bill Gibson's find that you ever held in your hand?
This is the most that I've held of Bill's collection. Now, Bill's collection was pretty vast.
It was massive.
And as I understand, he gave away a lot of that. He gave away a lot. And there's not that much left of what he had. But here we've got a handful of coins that could have been beat out by the Montgomery of Swift legend.
You had talks with Bill, and he said there was more in there, correct?
I spent an afternoon with Bill before I published my book, and then afterwards he came up and heard me talk. So we talked several different times. But he would always tell you things, but I always felt like he was holding some back.
Now you all got the answer. I told you tonight after Daddy.
If you're Jonathan Swift during this time, especially in the 1790s, after John Filson's disappearance, after James Harrod's disappearance, you may want to see that the stories become muddled, murky. In other words, let's mislead the story a little bit. Let's set some dates back too far or whatever. Let's make the stories obscure so we can kind of protect the identity of this man. He would have wanted to be low-key. You know, there might have been people looking for him.
How many Filsons or Harrods that we don't know about, lesser-known men who maybe got too close, ended up missing?
Well, we can only speculate there, but two very visible historical person who just disappeared while looking for him.
You know, he had, according to legend, he had some traveling companions. And you can imagine when treasure's involved, there had to be a little light in somebody's eye thinking, hey, you know, we've got this over here. There was a supposed fight, correct?
That's right. Two of Swift's men, Flint and Fletcher, got into a sword fight. And Flint wounded Fletcher, and Fletcher ended up dying from his wounds. Each of those men buried a great hoard of coins each before they had their fight. And so, I mean, according to that, it could very well be that you found, Bill Gibson may have found Fletcher's stash.
So these men had to be paid off in some form or fashion for risking life and limb for the government and traveling with Jonathan Swift.
They were probably largely patriotic, but they would have had to been paid, and Washington would have seen to it that these men would have been rewarded. Of course, that reward could partly have been in salt or any other type of minerals that they, and one of the things that may have made the pack train coming into Kentucky plausible, kind of made it invisible. Coming in, you may have been loaded with silver, but going out, you may have been loaded with salt, which Jonathan Swift sold in abundance in his stores. All of the ads that you've seen placed in the Alexandria Advertiser talked about Swift selling salt.
We're actually holding some of these coins in our hand from that treasure. One thing you'll notice rather quickly is the difference in the size and the quality. And you got to wonder, where did these coins come from? Why did he need a coin maker? Why did he have ships? What can we speculate here? I mean, we can figure out so much here. But what was this whole story? Where did this treasure come from? Where did the silver come from? How were they minted?
There's still a world of speculation that could be done. But one of the things that we have done, we have set aside the fact that Swift was real, his treasure was real, and much of the stories of legend were based upon real things that happened. We know for certain that Jonathan Swift, he owned a tract of land in was present-day Fairfax, Virginia, that had 1,437 acres in it. It was called the Long Glades, and we know that part of that property, or owned part of a silver mine on that property. The silver could have come from there that he was associated with. That property adjoined a silversmith. So we had a silversmith and Swift all right there in the same place in Fairfax, Virginia.
Something we have to address geologically is there are no significant amounts of silver to be found in Kentucky, correct?
As I understand it, if you go directly to the state geological office, they'll tell you that there's no commercial quantities of silver or gold in Kentucky. It's not to say that you may not find a little bit of gold or silver, and you may find a little silver in some lead, and you get some silver as a byproduct of mining lead or something like that, or zinc. But there's not those precious metals in Kentucky in commercial quantities.
Now, the thing that I find fascinating, pieces of 8, regardless of where the silver came from, it had to be put into coin shape. It just so happens that pieces of 8 were widely accepted forms of coinage.
It was definitely one of the most popular coins in that time period.
Right. And they cut it into pieces of 8, am I correct?
That's correct. They would chisel on it and you could get 8 pieces out of it.
Let's talk about that. When you see these coins that have obviously, they were dated 1730 to 1760 from this particular find, well, there are various conditions. And I mean, if you want to really speculate, some of them are in really good shape and they look kind of the same, but they kind of deteriorate as you went past a certain point.
I can't visualize that a Mexican mint would produce anything other than a perfect coin. And you can look at these coins here and see that discrepancy.
Why do you think that is?
Well, if you're hammering them out in a cave in Pine Mountain, you're not going to get them perfect.
That's a real mental picture there. You can look at a lot of avenues here. He owned ships. There's speculation that this guy was maybe a privateer, a pirate, that maybe he was knocking ships over, bringing coinage back.
That's part of the legend. The part of the legend is that Swift and his men frequented the Spanish Main. And but once again, it's all in the family. Daniel Roberto, his father-in-law, owned, that we know of, 3 privateers. And he made several good sacks during the Revolutionary War, made some valuable captured. He referred to as some coinage and plates. Now exactly what the plates were, I'm not sure, but it could have been something like coin dies.
Well, of course, you know, there was all the old stories about pirate treasure being transported here, that Swift was associated with pirates. There was even some horrible tales about massacres of people who knew too much and things of that nature. Then, of course, you've got to remember something. When you start putting Swift with the creation of the American Republic under George Washington's time, this country, you talk about starting on a shoestring. We did not have anything at all, especially a treasury. And if some silver had been accumulated, say even from loans, from the Spanish, from the Dutch, whatever, and you've got to remember also, Spanish silver was the main thing of trade in those days. Even our term dollar eventually even came from something like that. But Spanish pieces of 8, Spanish silver. If, say, there had been a collection of silver either in its raw form or in its minted form, and the British were after you, what better place to hide it than in Kentucky, which was the wilderness, the frontier that nobody hardly ever came to because it was dangerous, for one thing. And especially when you start hearing the stories about people actually seeing some of this silver, and some of it was minted. So I cannot help but think, where there's that much smoke, there's a little fire.
So here we have this shadowy character, but all these legends that were laid out over here, they had to be to throw people off the track, because you don't want people knowing where our national treasure is. 1812, the British came looking for it. They didn't find it. Where was it? Here's all these land holdings. Here's one little batch of treasure that's 1,600 pounds. What lies somewhere else?
Washington would have viewed Kentucky as a huge asset in this regard. What state do you know of that has more caves than we do? And at that time, 90% of them were uncharted.
We won't have a treasure unless you have someone who stashed a treasure. And Jonathan Swift had fallen so much under the cloak of legendary figure that a lot of people even thought maybe he didn't even exist. You know, I've heard a lot of people say that. And he did exist. He was a very, very lively person, very well connected. And so if anyone could have pulled off something like that, Swift would have been your man. Kind of an unsung hero of the birth of America in many ways.
So here's this whole underground group of people who know about this. Now a lot more are going to know about it. Here's the facts and figures. Here's somebody who's dug deep and found these wonderful bits of history, so we can paint this picture of this man who's never had a picture painted of him. Fantastic story. I got to thank you so much for doing the work and clearing things up for a lot of us.
One of the things that we have to go on today that people back 100 years ago didn't have to go on, they didn't know exactly where his properties were. But now we do. It's the outlines of his property are listed in that book. There's got to be, whether there's treasure left or not, who knows? But there's got to be some archaeological treasures out there. Now that would be a great thing if somebody could find some archaeological evidence of their work.
And maybe with this, more people are going to really start digging. And I think the most fascinating thing about this whole thing is when you watch and you look at his travels and his trails, Fort Knox, the national treasure.
It's just, you can't get around it. It's always right in the middle.
Man, oh man, you finally told the story that needed to be told.
Tim, thank you so much.
No, thank you.